There's something profoundly disorienting that happens when you begin to wake up, and I mean really wake up to the nature of reality, to the games we've been playing, to the stories we've been telling ourselves about who we are and what this whole existence is about. It's as if you've been living your entire life in a room painted in shades of gray, and suddenly someone throws open the curtains and light comes flooding in. At first, you can barely see. Your eyes hurt. Everything looks strange and unfamiliar. And then, slowly, you start to make out colors you never knew existed, textures you never noticed, dimensions of space that were always there but completely invisible to you before. And here's what nobody tells you about this awakening, this shift in consciousness. The hardest part isn't the awakening itself, it's what comes after. It's returning to that world you thought you knew, only now you see it differently. You see the patterns, the conditioning, the endless loops of reactivity and fear and grasping. You see how people are sleepwalking through their lives, and this is the difficult part. You realize you can't simply shake them awake. More than that, you realize that some people, perhaps many people, will actively resist your awakening. They'll try to pull you back into the dream. And the question that arises, the question we need to talk about today, is this: how do you navigate relationships after awakening? Which people must you avoid, or at least approach with tremendous care? Now, let me be very clear about something right from the start. This isn't about judgment. This isn't about looking down on people who haven't had the same realizations you've had. That would be the ego co-opting your awakening, turning spiritual insight into spiritual superiority, which is perhaps the most dangerous trap of all. No, this is about something much more practical, much more immediate. It's about survival. It's about protecting the tender, fragile flame of your awakening from being extinguished by the winds of unconsciousness that still dominate so much of human interaction. Think of it this way. Imagine you've been sick for years with an illness you didn't even know you had. Then, miraculously, you find the cure. You begin to heal. Your body starts to remember what health feels like, but you're still weak, still recovering. Would you immediately return to the environment that made you sick in the first place? Would you surround yourself with people who insist that your illness was normal, that everyone has it, that you're being dramatic for seeking health? Of course not. You'd create space. You'd protect your recovery. You'd be selective about who you allow into your convalescence. Awakening is like this. It's a kind of healing from a condition so universal that most people don't even recognize it as a condition. We might call it unconsciousness, or identification with the ego, or living in a dream of thought-created separation. Alan Watts called it the illusion of the separate self. That feeling that you are a little isolated center of consciousness, locked inside a bag of skin, fundamentally separate from everything else, engaged in a desperate struggle to survive and get what you need from a hostile or indifferent universe. When you wake up from this illusion, even partially, even momentarily, everything changes. You begin to see that the boundaries you thought were so solid are actually permeable, even illusory. You sense your connection to the larger whole. You recognize that much of what you thought was important, the endless pursuit of status, the accumulation of things, the desperate need for approval, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what you are. You see how much energy you've been wasting on problems that aren't real problems, on fears that dissolve when you really look at them, on a future that never comes and a past that never leaves. This is beautiful, this is liberating. But here's the problem, and it's a significant one. You still have to live in the world. You still have relationships, obligations, a life that was built on the old assumptions. And the people in your life, your family, your friends, your colleagues, they're still operating from the old paradigm. They're still playing the game. And many of them expect you to keep playing too. Now, some people, when you share what's happened to you, will be curious. They'll see something different in you, a lightness perhaps, or a groundedness, or a lack of the anxiety that used to drive you, and they'll be drawn to it. They'll ask questions. They'll want to understand. These people are gifts. They're fellow travelers, even if they're at different points on the path. Stay close to these people. Cherish them. These are the ones who remind you that you're not crazy, that what you've seen is real, that the awakening is possible. But then there are the others, and this is what we really need to talk about. First, there are what we might call the defenders of the dream. These are people who are deeply invested in the consensus reality, the shared hallucination that most of society operates from. They've built their entire identity, their sense of security, their understanding of how the world works on certain assumptions. That life is a competition, that you need to constantly strive and achieve to be worthy. That happiness is something you get from external circumstances. That the accumulation of wealth and status and achievements is what gives life meaning. When you wake up, you implicitly challenge these assumptions simply by your presence, by your way of being. You're no longer driven by the same fears and desires. You're not interested in the same competitions. You don't respond to the same triggers. And this is threatening to people who are still fully identified with the dream, because your very existence suggests that there might be another way, that perhaps they've been chasing the wrong things, sacrificing their peace and authenticity for goals that don't actually deliver what they promise. The defenders of the dream will try to pull you back in. They'll question your choices. They'll tell you you're being irresponsible, naive, unrealistic. If you were climbing the corporate ladder and now you're not so interested in the climb, they'll tell you you're throwing your life away. If you used to share their obsession with material success and now you're more interested in presence and awareness, they'll tell you you're being lazy or unmotivated. If you were always anxious and driven and now you're calm and accepting, they'll tell you you've lost your edge. What you have to understand is that they're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to protect themselves. Your awakening is a mirror, and what it reflects back to them is the possibility that they're living an unexamined life, that they're running on autopilot, that they're slaves to conditioning and fear, and that's too uncomfortable for many people to face. So instead of looking in the mirror, they try to convince you that the mirror is broken, that you're the one who's confused or deluded. From my own experience, I can tell you this. You cannot wake these people up by arguing with them. You cannot convince them through logic or evidence that there's a different way of being. All you'll do is exhaust yourself and invite them to become even more defensive, even more committed to their position. The paradox is that the more you try to show someone that they're dreaming, the more you're playing into the very ego dynamics that keep the dream alive. You're making it into a conflict, a me versus you, right versus wrong situation, which is exactly the kind of dualistic thinking that awakening transcends. So what do you do with the defenders of the dream? You create distance. Not necessarily physical distance, though sometimes that's necessary, but psychological distance. You stop trying to convince them. You stop expecting them to understand. You love them if you can, but you love them from a place of acceptance of where they are, not from a place of wanting them to be different. And you protect your own practice, your own awakening, by limiting how much energy you give to these interactions. Then there are what I call the energy vampires. These are the people who are operating from a place of deep unconsciousness and reactivity, and who seem to feed on drama, conflict, negativity, and chaos. You know these people. They're always in crisis. They're always outraged about something. They're constantly pulling others into their emotional storms. They gossip, they complain, they criticize. They live in a perpetual state of victimhood, seeing threats and insults everywhere, convinced that the world is against them and that nothing is ever their fault. Before your awakening, you might have gotten sucked into their energy field. You might have tried to help them, to fix their problems, to make them feel better. Or you might have joined them in their complaints and their drama because at the time it felt normal. That was just how life was, full of problems and conflicts and difficulties that needed to be endlessly discussed and worried about. But after awakening, you start to see these patterns for what they are. You see how much of what these people call problems are actually self-created, born from resistance to what is, from expectations of how things should be, from stories about the past and future that have no reality in the present moment. You see how they're addicted to their suffering, how they use it as a way to get attention, to manipulate others, to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives. And you see how being around them pulls you out of presence, out of peace, back into the drama of the egoic mind. Here's what you need to understand. These people will drain you. They'll take your energy, your peace, your clarity, and they'll give you nothing but chaos in return. And the terrible thing is, you can't help them, at least not in the way they seem to want. Because what they're really asking for isn't help, it's validation of their victimhood, confirmation that their suffering is real and justified, someone to join them in their misery. The compassionate thing to do, both for yourself and for them, is to disengage, to refuse to play the role they're unconsciously casting you in. This doesn't mean you can't care about them. It doesn't mean you have to be cold or cruel, but it means you stop feeding the pattern. You stop trying to rescue them. You stop allowing their chaos to become your chaos. You create boundaries, firm and clear boundaries, and you hold them with love but without wavering. And here's a third category, perhaps the most subtle and therefore the most dangerous, the spiritual ego. These are people who have had some degree of awakening, some spiritual insight or experience, but who have then allowed the ego to co-opt it. They've turned awakening into a new identity, a new way of being special, a new hierarchy where they're on top because they're more conscious or more evolved than others. You'll recognize these people because they talk about their spiritual experiences in a way that's really about positioning themselves as superior. They name-drop teachers and traditions. They use spiritual language as a weapon to dismiss or diminish others. They create artificial distinctions between the awakened and the unawakened, the conscious and the unconscious. And they clearly see themselves in the former category and most other people in the latter. They might be subtly competitive about their practice, meditating longer, attending more retreats, having more dramatic experiences. Or they might be judgmental, looking down on people who still care about worldly things, who still have desires and preferences and human emotions. This is insidious because it looks like awakening. It uses all the right words, all the right concepts, but underneath, it's the same old ego game, just in spiritual clothing, and it's particularly dangerous for someone who's newly awakened, because these people seem like they should be your allies, your community. They speak your language. They've had experiences that sound similar to yours, but spending time with them doesn't lead to deeper awakening. It leads to subtle competition, comparison, and judgment, which are exactly the opposite of what true awakening brings. The spiritual ego will make you doubt your own experience if it doesn't match their map. They'll tell you you're doing it wrong if your awakening doesn't look like theirs. They'll create pressure to have certain experiences, to reach certain states, to conform to their understanding of what awakening is supposed to be. And all of this pulls you out of the direct, immediate, alive quality of your own awakening and back into the mind, into conceptual understanding, into the pursuit of some future state of enlightenment, rather than the recognition of what's already here. From these people, you need the most discernment, because they can seem so right, so aligned with the path. But watch how you feel around them. Does your sense of spaciousness and presence increase, or does it contract? Do you feel more accepting of yourself and others? Or do you feel inadequate, like you need to be more or different than you are? Does the interaction feel like a genuine sharing between two aspects of the same consciousness, or does it feel like a subtle power game? Trust your direct experience over anyone's conceptual map, no matter how sophisticated it sounds. True awakening doesn't create hierarchy, it dissolves it. It recognizes the equal absolute value of all expressions of consciousness, from the realized master to the confused beginner to the person who's never even heard of spiritual awakening. Any teaching or teacher or fellow traveler who makes you feel less than, who makes awakening into something you have to achieve or prove, is coming from ego, not from awakening. Now, let's talk about what happens when you don't avoid these people, when you don't create boundaries and protect your awakening. Because the consequences are real, and they can be devastating. The first thing that happens is doubt. When you're constantly surrounded by people who don't see what you see, who think you're confused or deluded, who pressure you to return to old ways of being, you start to question your own experience. The mind is so conditioned to seek approval, to conform, to fit in, that it will actually suppress your own direct knowing in favor of consensus reality. You'll find yourself thinking, maybe they're right. Maybe I was just going through a phase. Maybe I'm being naive or impractical. This doubt is corrosive. It doesn't attack your awakening directly, it's more subtle than that. It introduces a kind of static into your clarity, a background noise of uncertainty that makes it harder to rest in presence, harder to trust your intuition, harder to act from authentic understanding rather than conditioned reflex. Over time, if you don't protect yourself from this influence, the doubt can become so loud that it drowns out the still, small voice of awakening entirely, and you find yourself pulled back into the dream, telling yourself it was never real in the first place. Then there's exhaustion. Constantly defending your perspective, explaining yourself, trying to maintain your center while people are pulling you in every direction, it's tiring. Awakening brings a natural effortlessness, a flow and ease with what is. But trying to hold on to that ease while swimming against the current of unconscious relationships is like trying to meditate in a nightclub. It's not impossible, but it requires a level of energy and effort that defeats the whole point. And when you're exhausted, you become vulnerable. Your clarity dims. Your awareness contracts. You start reacting instead of responding. The old patterns, the old conditioning, they're all still there, just waiting for a moment of weakness to reassert themselves. And if you're constantly depleting your energy trying to maintain your awakening in hostile or unconscious environments, that moment of weakness will come. But perhaps the most painful consequence is the loss of authenticity. When you're around people who can't or won't see you as you actually are, who want you to be who you used to be, who reward you for playing old roles and punish you for breaking out of them, you face a terrible choice. Be yourself and be rejected, or hide yourself and be accepted. And if you choose the latter, if you start putting on masks again, playing the old games, pretending to care about things you no longer care about, laughing at jokes that aren't funny, engaging in conversations that feel empty, you lose something precious. You lose your integrity, not in a moral sense, but in the literal sense, your wholeness, your integration. You become split again, divided between the you that knows and the you that pretends not to know, between your authentic being and your social performance. And this division is suffering. It's exactly the kind of internal conflict that awakening dissolves. To voluntarily return to it, just to maintain relationships that require you to be unconscious, is a betrayal of yourself and of the awakening that has graced you. So what's the path forward? How do you navigate this territory with wisdom and compassion? First, You have to get clear on what awakening actually is, because there's a lot of confusion about this, and the confusion itself causes unnecessary suffering. Awakening is not about becoming a different person. It's not about transcending your humanity or becoming perfectly peaceful and blissful all the time. It's not about never having negative emotions or never caring about practical matters or never enjoying simple pleasures. Awakening is about seeing through the illusion of the separate self. It's about recognizing that what you are is not the small, isolated, defended identity you thought you were, but something much vaster, much more open, much more deeply connected to everything else. And from that recognition flows a natural reorientation of values, priorities, and ways of being. Not because you should change or because you're trying to be more spiritual, but simply because you see reality more clearly, and you naturally respond differently to what you see. This means you don't have to become someone completely different. You don't have to abandon all your old interests or relationships. You don't have to move to a monastery or speak in hushed, reverent tones about the ineffable mystery of existence. You can still be you, in fact. You can be more genuinely, fully, unself-consciously you than you ever were before. Because you're no longer trying so hard to be something, to prove something, to get something. But you do need to be selective about your environment, especially in the early stages of awakening, when the shift is still fresh and vulnerable to being overshadowed by old conditioning. And this selectivity is an act of love, not of judgment. You're not saying there's something wrong with unconscious people. You're simply recognizing that you need to protect and nurture your own awakening, and that means being strategic about where you put your energy and attention. So how do you do this practically? How do you create the boundaries and distance we've been talking about without becoming isolated or self-righteous? The key is to meet people where they are without losing yourself where you are. This is an art, not a science. It requires tremendous presence and flexibility. With some people, family members you can't avoid, colleagues you work with, you might not be able to create physical distance, but you can create psychological distance. You can be in the room without being identified with the energy in the room. You can participate in conversations without getting pulled into the drama or the unconsciousness. You can be friendly, even loving, while internally maintaining your center, your awareness, your connection to something deeper than the surface content of the interaction. This is what Watts meant when he talked about being in the world but not of it. You're participating in the play, but you know it's a play. You're playing your role, but you're not completely identified with the character. There's a part of you that remains aware of the awareness itself, the space in which all these roles and games and dramas are happening. With other people, friends who are pulling you backwards, relationships built on dysfunction, you might need to create actual distance. This doesn't have to be dramatic. You don't need to make a big announcement or burn bridges. You can simply become less available, respond less frequently, decline invitations, let the relationship naturally fade as you invest your energy elsewhere. If someone asks what's changed, you can be honest but gentle. I'm going through some changes. I need some space to figure things out. Most people will respect that, and those who don't, who push and demand and try to make you feel guilty for creating boundaries, well, that's exactly the behavior that confirms you need the distance. And then actively seek out conscious relationship. Find people who are also on this path, who are also waking up, who can see you and meet you in that awakened space. This might be a meditation group, a spiritual teacher, an online community, a single friend who gets it. The form doesn't matter. What matters is that you have somewhere you can be fully yourself, where you don't have to hide or perform, where your awakening is recognized and honored and supported. These relationships are like water in the desert. They remind you that you're not alone, not crazy, not making it all up. They provide a kind of positive feedback loop where consciousness recognizes itself And in that recognition, both parties are lifted. This is what spiritual community is really about. Not people getting together to talk about spiritual concepts, but people creating a field of collective presence where awakening is easier, more natural, more sustainable. But even as you seek conscious relationship, be careful not to make it into a new exclusive club. Don't let it become us versus them, the awakened versus the sleepers. That's just the ego again, creating separation, finding a new way to be special. Hold everyone in love, even especially those you need to distance yourself from. See the sleeping people not as wrong or inferior, but as yourself from an earlier chapter, before you woke up, when you were also caught in the dream. This understanding brings a kind of tenderness, a compassion that doesn't need to fix or change or rescue anyone. You can let people be where they are, even as you honor where you are. You can love them without needing them to see what you see. And paradoxically, when you stop trying to wake people up, when you stop needing them to validate your awakening, sometimes that's when they become most curious, most open, most ready to look at what you're pointing to. Because here's the final thing you need to understand: the best teaching is your being, not your words. When you're genuinely at peace, when you're moving through life with grace and presence and authenticity, people notice. They might not understand it. They might not be able to articulate what's different about you, but they feel it. And some of them, when they're ready, will want what you have. Not the concepts, not the techniques, not the spiritual identity, but the actual peace, the actual freedom, the actual aliveness that awakening brings. And when those people show up, welcome them, share with them, support them. Be for them what you needed when you were first waking up: a mirror, a confirmation, a reminder that it's possible, that it's real, that they're not alone. But until then, protect your flame, guard your peace. Choose your company wisely, not from fear, not from superiority, but from a deep respect for the preciousness of what has been given to you, and from a commitment to nurturing it until it becomes so established, so integrated, that no external circumstance can shake it. Because that's the ultimate freedom, not needing to avoid anyone, because you've become so rooted in awareness that you can be anywhere with anyone and still remain awake. But until you reach that place, until the awakening has deepened from a glimpse into a ground, from an experience into a way of being, be wise, be selective, be protective of what matters most. Remember, awakening is not a destination, it's a direction. Every moment is a choice to stay conscious or to fall back asleep, to honor your truth or to betray it, to nurture your clarity or to let it be clouded. And one of the most important ways you make this choice is through the company you keep, the environments you inhabit, the energies you allow into your space. Choose wisely, choose consciously, choose love, both for others and for yourself, and trust that in protecting your awakening, in being ruthlessly selective about what you allow into your consciousness, you're not being selfish, you're being responsible. You're honoring the gift. You're becoming a clear channel through which consciousness can flow into this world, which desperately needs more awakened beings, more people who have seen through the dream and are living from that seeing. That's what we're called to do. Not to abandon the world, but to be in it fully, consciously, awake. And sometimes, the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for others is to step back from relationships that would pull us back into unconsciousness, creating space for new relationships, new connections, new ways of being together that honor and celebrate the awakening that has found us. This is the path. Walk it with care, with courage, and with compassion for yourself, for others, and for the mysterious consciousness that is looking through all our eyes, waking up to itself one human being at a time.